Hi everyone, welcome to week 13, our final week of formal classes. So this week we're going to be grounding some of the topics that we've covered so far this term, specifically identity, gender performativity, incommensurability, social constructionist theory, post-colonial theory, the ethics of care within a relational post-foundational sense, heteronormativity, difference, power, and positionality, and we'll be thinking with these concepts and situating them within the BC early learning framework. So seeing how these ideas might matter pedagogically. So throughout this course, we've been engaging in readings and conversations that aim to unsettle our ways of seeing. At the beginning of this course, I said that much of what we're going to be talking about is intended to disrupt how you view reality. So we've asked questions such as, how are identities socially constructed and cultivated? And we've discussed in detail that identity is not static. It's not a knowable trait or categories of who somebody is. And we've explored ways of seeing through poetic writing and through arts-based exercises to better allow us to think in places that move beyond categorical thought, places that dance between things and honor multiplicity and the impermanence of who we've been, who we are, and who we might become. So we've considered identity as something that isn't necessarily located within, but rather constructed in relation with others as a lived phenomenon. We've also asked, how are the ethical and political configurations of difference lived in early childhood education? We've examined the social constructions of race, gender, sexuality, class, and ableism, and the ways in which these social constructs are performed and enacted in relation to dominant discourses surrounding early childhood. We've discussed the ongoing colonial legacies that inform these discourses and create knowledges and ways of being that are commonly valued. And we've unpacked how these discourses create what Alexis Shotwell calls a terrain of possibilities within early childhood education that both inhibit and enable our ways of being, and how ourselves as subjects are continually mitigating this terrain of possibilities. We've asked questions about the way, what ways of seeing inform our visions of children and inclusive practice, that our ways of seeing don't come out of nowhere, that they're informed by our histories and our positionalities. And this is not suggesting that as we interrogate these positionalities, that these experiences and histories need to be suspended or withheld in the pursuit of objectivity or neutrality in our practice with children. They're not necessarily bad, but that they need to be deeply thought with and considered as we implicate ourselves in the construction of knowledge and how we're working with children pedagogically. So these positionalities inform the ways in which we're able to negotiate and exercise power within shifting systems and privilege certain people with access to power within these systems. So considering these positionalities, we've interrogated the image of the early childhood educator as one that's heavily gendered and classed within ideologies of whiteness. And this is something that was really discussed in the Lady Bountiful article that we discussed. So a huge term that I think we've really focused on interrogating in this course is the language of inclusion. We've considered the ways in which inclusion itself could be argued as a way of preparing children to fit in, to be included to the dominant structures of society, and how this very idea could be an act of assimilation into colonial structures. So therefore, when thinking of inclusion in this course, we've been thinking less about how to help children fit in, but rather thinking about how we might honor difference and reconfigure where in is, the social construction that creates normativities where in exists. And we do this first by interrogating our own thinking and ways of seeing, and considering a pedagogy of listening as an orientation that might better honor multiplicities and attend to ways of being that might lie outside of what we already know or are accustomed to. So in reading Alexis Shotwell's chapter last week, we considered the very difficult question, how then, in the context of early childhood education, might we imagine worlds that are radically different from the ones in which we live? How do we craft new worlds, as Shotwell says, within the shell of the old? And again, thinking with these kinds of speculative futures, I invite you to challenge yourself to go beyond what individual educators need to or should be doing, and think more about your own thinking. What are the rationalities and logics that you might need to interrogate and disrupt if other worlds are to become possible, if you're to question and renegotiate how you configure yourself within normative discourses? And again, not to rid ourselves of normativity, because that's impossible. We're always already entangled in these normative discourses, but rather how might you stretch and pull them apart in ways that you can imagine other ways of being within them. So what assumptions about yourself as an educator might need to be interrogated if listening is to take place? So what thoughts need to shift if difference and multiplicity is to become the basis of curriculum and pedagogy? So this week we're going to be pulling together some of the threads that you've gathered in this course and situating these threads within the BC Early Learning Framework. So you're going to be reading the Early Learning Framework draft of 2019, specifically the sections called the Early Learning Framework is an invitation to engage with complexity. That's on page 12. You'll also be reading Well-Being and Belonging, which is on pages 40 to 41. And you'll be reading Identity, Social Responsibility, and Diversity, which is on pages 44 to 45. We'll also be thinking with the Pathways for Engagement charts, specifically Pathways for Engaging with Well-Being and Belonging on page 46, and Pathways for Engaging with Identity, Social Responsibility, and Diversity on page 53. So you'll be overlaying this reading of the BC Early Learning Framework with one reading of your choice from the course in this week's provocation forum. So you'll be using this chosen article to help you in thinking through the questions offered in either of the pathways in the chart. So for example, you can use an article like, for example, last week's chapter by Alexis Shotwell, and you can choose to either think with Pathways for Engaging with Well-Being and Responsibility, or the Pathways for Engaging with Identities for Social Responsibility. So within either of these sections within the BC Early Learning Framework charts, choose one question that you'd like to respond to. So for example, on page 41 in the Well-Being and Belonging chart, there's a question within the section Family Composition and Gender Formation that asks, what is the story of how I came to understand gender? In your response, you could, for example, draw on Judith Butler's article on gender performativity to help you answer this question in a way that's not only based on your opinion and your personal experiences, but that's also enriched with theoretical support from Butler. So what does Butler offer you as you respond to this question in the BC Early Learning Framework? So in other words, you're going to choose one question within these two charts and compose a response that utilizes an article that we've read this term. So in our other discussions, as we've talked about in our other discussions, this response is reliant on the readings to support your ideas. It's not only your opinion and not only your experiences, but also has a theoretical grounding in the texts that we've been reading so far this term. So I think that's about it. If you visit the video from last week, you'll have more information into the upcoming synopsis assignment that can help you there. I'm also happy to support you with a Skype meeting or talk through email. But just a reminder that with regard to your support in your synopsis assignments, please do contact me well in advance before the due date so that we have time to arrange a meeting and have a conversation. Okay, thank you so much, everybody.